Okay, buckle up. This one is big. If you've seen the HBO series Rome, series 1 and 2, you can skip this one. This is quicker than watching two series of HBO's Rome. Arguably, it's considerably less interesting. I'll give you the choice. We're going to look at the collapse of the Republic. We've had a look at some of the things in the background that were weakening the Republic in previous videos. So, the optimates in the Senate wanted the Senate to govern Rome, but they were very, very reluctant for any individual Roman to have much power. This is a cultural thing in ancient Rome, going back to the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud in 510 BCE. Monarchy is something the Romans were very, very jittery around, and if anybody even appeared to be behaving as a king, or more accurately, a tyrant, things would be done. So the idea of one man amassing a lot of power was very, very uncomfortable for the Romans. This becomes problematic when you remember that the provinces of Rome were being governed by individual men. And those individual men, while they were governors, would often attempt to amass and accumulate wealth, or more dangerous for the Senate, dignitas, reputation, public standing. We now come to the character that defines this particular period of history. Enter Julius Caesar. He's a popularis, and he was feared because he was so ambitious. And when he was not able to be successful through the Senate, he had no hesitation about going to the people's assemblies. Caesar was able to tap into the discontent of the poorest members of Roman society, those who felt left behind, in order to achieve his own success, his own popularity. You can see echoes of this in any number of political figures through history. People who, through traditional political channels, were not able to be successful, were able to appeal to the mass, those who felt somehow left behind by politics or by the direction in which a nation is going. It's reasonably common, alarmingly common in the 21st century. Anyway, so that was one way in which you could go around the Senate, you could go to the people's assemblies, and Julius Caesar did. But some politicians were even less cunning than that. They would just pay thugs to beat up and intimidate rivals. If a politician had previously been a governor or had raised an army for a particular reason, they could call upon their support from the armed forces. Roman politics was pretty brutal by our standards, that's for sure. We're going to park Julius Caesar for the moment, which is a sentence I hadn't anticipated saying today. And we're going to look at two other figures who slightly predate him, Marius and Sulla. Marius was a popularis politician, Sulla very much an optimatus. Anyway, a civil war erupted between these two extremely popular candidates, one popular with the landowners, one popular with the people, but in this case, Marius, you remember, who implemented the military reforms that allowed individuals to raise professional armies. Those armies were loyal to the general, not to Rome. He was defeated, and Sulla enacted a number of rules in an attempt to rein in the powers of the People's Assembly. The Senate could see that certain individuals were able to go to the People's Assemblies in instances where they were being denied in the Senate. So Sulla simply attempted to weaken that and strengthen the position of the Senate. So at the end of the Civil War in 87 BCE, the Senate seemed very much to be on top of things. But as is always the case, when you have a conflict between two sides and one side is defeated and their considerations are not taken into account, the resentment lingers. Anyway, 79 BCE, Sulla, winner of the civil war, dies. And Pompey Magnus, well, at this stage he's not called Pompey Magnus, he's just called Pompey. He becomes the biggest figure in Roman politics. How did he achieve his success? Well, certainly through his military endeavours, but also in the Senate, he overturned a number of Sulla's reforms. You can see how there's this almost game of tennis going on between the two sides in the Senate. One proposes laws, the other undoes them, another proposes them, another undoes them, and so on. Anyway, it's hard to stress how popular Pompey was, because the period has become so dominated by Julius Caesar. And don't get me wrong, Julius Caesar was monstrously popular, but before Caesar, Pompey was a huge, huge deal. He was awarded 2 special commands in his career. One was to eliminate pirates from the Mediterranean who were disrupting international trade for Rome, and he did that with breathtaking speed. And the second one was to eliminate King Mithridates in what we would call Turkey in Asia, as the Romans would have it. Mithridates was a king whose warlike tendencies were making it difficult for Roman business interests to settle in Asia. But while Pompey was away dealing with these things, of course, in the absence of one figure, another comes to the fore. This is always true in politics. And in Pompey's absence, Julius Caesar steps to the front. But then, of course, after 5 years or so away, Pompey turns up in Rome, and he asks them to do 2 things. Number 1, his changes in Asia, he wants them to be ratified in law. And number 2, he wants his veterans to be given land as he had promised them. Again, going back to Marius's military reforms, this was common for generals to promise their men. The Senate refused both of these things. So Pompey, very popular, very powerful, increasingly wealthy, but now quite angry. He enters into an alliance with Julius Caesar and Marcus Crassus, who is memorable, I guess, for anyone with a passing interest in the period, because he was the richest man in Rome. He had all of the money. A very useful ally to have. But the idea was that between the 3 of them, they would essentially divide up rule of Rome. This alliance of 3 was called the Triumvirate. The VIR in the middle of triumvirate. Vir is the Latin for man, tri, 3. It's the 3-man gang. But the idea was they would support each other's political ambitions and careers. This was established in 60 BCE and 59 BCE. Caesar became consul, which was the highest position in Roman government. And one of the first things he did was corral support in the Senate for Pompey's arrangements in Asia and had them ratified. Is this democracy? Is this what the Republic was meant to do? Senators who had served as a magistrate for 1 year were usually offered a governorship of a province the following year. So Caesar has finished being consul, and it is his due, he would consider it his right, to be given the governorship of a province. But the Senate was really, really wary about Caesar. They were not comfortable with the amount of power he had. So he had to appeal to the assembly of the people because the Senate would not give him a province. And via the assembly of the people, he secured a 5-year governorship of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum. Not the most lucrative provinces that he could have had. And this would have been deliberate. If Caesar must have a province, let's not give him a province where he can make himself too rich, too powerful, acquire too much status, dignitas, and so on. So you can see in the map that's on the screen there, Cisalpine Gaul is Gaul on this side of the Alps. But very quickly, Caesar expanded into Transalpine Gaul, which you should be able to work out means Gaul on the other side of the Alps. And from there, he began his campaign into the rest of Gaul. While Caesar's away, Crassus serves as consul for a year, and after that he wants his province, as is his right, and he goes to Parthia in an attempt to subjugate the province, and he failed, and he was killed in 53 BCE. Famously, his love of gold, his love of money, very much went before him. And when he was killed, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat. It's hard to think of a worse way to die. So Crassus is suddenly out of the picture, and Pompey is starting to get a little bit worried because it turns out that Caesar in Gaul is actually something of a military genius, and he's achieving amazing things. Now, the alliance between Caesar and Pompey had been especially close because in 59 BCE, Caesar had married his daughter to Pompey. However, in 54 BCE, Julia, Caesar's daughter, went into a premature labour and she died giving birth, according to some sources, to a son, other sources to a daughter. Either way, the child died as well. But with the death of Julia, the connection between Caesar and Pompey weakens. Pompey chooses to side with the optimates in the Senate, and we are led to break down. Caesar had raised armies and begun the conquest of Gaul without sanction from the Senate, which meant that when he returned to Rome, he would face charges. Aware of this, Caesar tries to find a way to get back to Rome without being charged. The strategy he comes up with is the idea that he should become consul again, but he would be awarded the consul while he was in Gaul, so that when he returned to Rome, it would be as consul and he could not be prosecuted. However, the Senate denied him this position, and in 49 BC they declared him an enemy of the people. Bear in mind, all the time he's been in Gaul, he's been sending back dispatches to be put up in public places, and he has become a folk hero for the Roman people. So the Senate, in antagonizing Caesar, in a way is antagonizing the people. And you're seeing this split once again in Roman society between the poorest and the richest. I'm being very broad in these terms, but that's essentially what it comes down to. Caesar has no option. So he marches his army south, crosses the Rubicon River, and heads for Rome. A civil war erupts between Caesar's side and Pompey's side. And Pompey is defeated, ultimately being beheaded in Egypt. Rather ignominious end for one of Rome's great generals. And then Caesar, he does that thing which is going too far. He makes a lot of changes, but the change which is difficult to stomach is he takes on the title of dictator for 10 years. Now, we think the word dictator is entirely bad. It was actually a fairly standard position in the Republic. In times of crisis, one man would be given dictatorial power, which meant they were allowed to do essentially whatever they needed to clear up a particular problem. But it was always a short-term position. Caesar takes the role of dictator initially for 10 years, which would have caused a lot of people to be slightly iffy. And then in 44 BC, he takes on the title of dictator in perpetuity, forever, which to anyone with a brain is just a king by a different name. One man rule forever. Caesar, whilst he overreaches in that regard, he ostensibly left the Republic to run, although he appointed new senators who would be loyal to him, and that made the Senate almost irrelevant because he could have his legislation put through without having to seek a consensus. With the Senate less and less relevant, Caesar taking on more and more power, history gives us this clarity of hindsight, and to us it seems obvious now that Caesar would have been murdered. And indeed, on the 15th of March, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar is stabbed to death. According to legend, on the Senate floor. As it happens, the Senate building had been burned down in 43 BCE, and Senate meetings were being held in a room in the complex of Pompey's theatre. So Julius Caesar was actually stabbed to death in or near to the theatre of his great rival Pompey. So what happens then? Well, the conspirators didn't actually have much of a plan. They believed that the Republic would sort of correct itself and things would proceed as they had in the past, but they didn't really have much of a plan. The armies of the conspirators were destroyed by Mark Antony and Octavian, both of whom were fighting in some way in the name of Julius Caesar, because that name Julius Caesar still carried a lot of popularity. The people still loved Caesar, and they did not approve entirely of his murder. Anyway, with the conspirators dead, Mark Antony, Octavian, and a third character, Marcus Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate to govern Rome and its provinces between 43 BCE and 33 BCE. But you can see this, it's like a whittling process with characters being cut to one side, and eventually it does lead to just one man. Lepidus, for example, was forced out of the triumvirate by Octavian. He was, shall we say, asked to retire. And the Roman world was essentially cut in half. Antony took the eastern provinces, the provinces which were considered to be un-Roman. They had great associations in the public mind in Rome as being decadent or being effeminate, or, generally just being un-Roman. Octavian took the western provinces, and that included Rome, which meant that while Antony was in Alexandria or any of the eastern provinces, Octavian was reinforcing his position in Rome. When Antony begins a relationship with Cleopatra, he is seen as going too far for two reasons. Number one, he's taken up with an Eastern queen. These ideas of Eastern decadence, which I've just mentioned, this is bad PR for Antony. And number two, as if it wasn't bad enough that he's taken up with an Eastern queen, he's already married, and he's already married to a Roman noblewoman. And the Roman noblewoman in question is Octavian's sister. So by taking up with Cleopatra, he is offending Roman matriarchy and Romanness. He's offending this sense of what is right and decorous in Rome. Obviously, a war erupts between these two, Octavian and Mark Antony. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Antony's forces are, if not quite destroyed as such, they are forced into such disarray. Octavian is able to press the advantage, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide in Alexandria. One man remains, That's Octavian. But Octavian knew that going back to how things were wasn't really an option, because for about the better part of 100 years, Rome has been in civil war of one kind or another. He needs to provide some kind of stability. He knew that Caesar had overreached, dictator for life, and he had given the Senate a pretext to commit murder. So how was he going to provide this stability? He couldn't entirely trust that the Senate would adopt policies which would allow stability, and he couldn't guarantee that the Senate would adopt policies that wouldn't lead to him being killed. So he did something similar to Julius Caesar, but he did it with a lot more elan, with a lot more panache. He preserved the mechanics of the Republic on the surface so that the Senate would be satisfied. However, he retained all of the key powers for himself. This way, the Senate was not so instantly motivated to get rid of him, but he was still running the show. He took on the name Augustus, which means the revered one, or a revered one. And in his Res Gestae, this is a public document that was put up on his mausoleum and on different outposts throughout the Roman Empire. He stated that I transferred the state from my own power to the control of the Senate and people of Rome. And this is very grand, and it makes Augustus look very benevolent, but it's an absolute lie. And we know that it's a lie because of the problem of succession that emerges after Augustus. If the Senate was in control of the Roman Republic, there wouldn't have been that problem. There is no skinny for this because it's too big. So you might want to go back and look over these slides and take notes. If you have any questions, ask me in class, or Twitter, email, or don't bother at all.